Vivian's decision to be visible was a bold move, and it sent a clear message to everyone in the company. No one was exempt from the responsibility of making Carter Aviation a better place for all. Positive outcomes, recognition for positive impact of Vivian's decisions started to show almost immediately. Marcus Thompson, the operations supervisor who had stepped in to support Vivian during the confrontation, was promoted to regional operations director. Marcus had been with the company for years, working his way up from the ground level, and Vivian had always seen potential in him, but it was his willingness to do the right thing in the face of pressure that truly set him apart. Vivian respected his integrity and wanted to reward it. "Marcus, your courage yesterday was exactly what we need in this company," Vivian said when she informed him of the promotion. "You stood up when it counted, and I know you'll continue to do the right thing as you take on more responsibility." Marcus's eyes filled with gratitude as he accepted the promotion. He had always worked hard, but in that moment, he understood that his loyalty to the company and to Vivian had paid off. Jennifer Kim, the junior ground crew member who had shown basic human decency by standing up for Vivian, was also recognized. Vivian saw something in Jennifer that she wanted to cultivate, a sense of fairness, an eye for detail, and the courage to do the right thing even when it was hard. Vivian awarded Jennifer a full scholarship to an aviation school, ensuring she would have the training and resources she needed to rise through the ranks. "I believe in you, Jennifer," Vivian said. "You showed us all what it means to stand up for what's right, and I want to help you grow into the leader you're capable of becoming." The recognition of Marcus and Jennifer set an example for the rest of the company. Vivian made it clear that those who demonstrated integrity, compassion, and respect would be rewarded. Meanwhile, those who chose to disregard those values would face the consequences. This wasn't just about making Vivian's company better. It was about creating a new standard for the entire industry. A reflection on legacy. The Carter family's new direction as the weeks passed, the transformation of Carter Aviation Group began to take shape. Vivian walked through the halls of the company, feeling a sense of pride she had never experienced before. The changes were visible not just in the policies, but in the attitudes of the employees. There was a new energy in the air, a sense of unity, of shared responsibility, and of purpose. Vivian reflected on the journey her family had been on. The Carter family had built an empire, yes, but they had done so under the shadow of privilege and secrecy. Her father, Charles Carter, had always believed in keeping a low profile, avoiding the spotlight. But Vivian had come to understand that true leadership wasn't about hiding in the shadows. It was about stepping into the light, owning your actions, and being accountable for your impact on the world. When Vivian arrived at her father's 70th birthday celebration in the Hamptons, 3 hours later than expected, she was emotionally drained. But Charles Carter saw something in his daughter that he hadn't seen before. He didn't see the businesswoman who had closed billion-dollar deals, or the quiet, invisible leader she had always been. He saw someone who had faced adversity and turned it into an opportunity for transformation. "You turned the worst day into the best lesson," Charles said, his voice filled with pride. "Your mother would be so proud." Vivian smiled softly, but the weight of the words hit her. Her mother, who had been a silent force behind the family's success, would have been proud to see her daughter take this bold step. Vivian had turned a painful moment into a defining one. She had changed not just her company, but the legacy of her family, and she had done it with grace, integrity, and courage. The ripple effect, a model for corporate America. Vivian's actions didn't just change her company, they changed the entire industry. Carter Aviation Group became a case study in how to handle systemic discrimination, not with vengeance, but with a revolution. The ripple effect of her decisions spread quickly, and soon other aviation companies were scrambling to implement similar policies. Vivian's leadership style gained national recognition. She was invited to speak at conferences, to testify before Congress about workplace discrimination, and to serve on panels about corporate responsibility. The woman who had spent her entire life avoiding publicity had become one of the most respected voices in American business. Her story of how she turned humiliation into transformation became an inspiration to thousands of entrepreneurs, CEOs, and leaders who were eager to emulate her example. Vivian had proven that true power wasn't about privilege or status. It was about using that power to create real change. And her company's legacy would forever be defined by her willingness to use her wealth to help others, to right the wrongs, and to build a world where respect was no longer optional. Vivian's decision to be visible was a bold move, and it sent a clear message to everyone in the company. No one was exempt from the responsibility of making Carter Aviation a better place for all. Positive outcomes, recognition for positive impact of Vivian's decisions started to show almost immediately. Marcus Thompson, the operations supervisor who had stepped in to support Vivian during the confrontation, was promoted to regional operations director. Marcus had been with the company for years, working his way up from the ground level, and Vivian had always seen potential in him, but it was his willingness to do the right thing in the face of pressure that truly set him apart. Vivian respected his integrity and wanted to reward it. Marcus, your courage yesterday was exactly what we need in this company, Vivian said when she informed him of the promotion. You stood up when it counted, and I know you'll continue to do the right thing as you take on more responsibility. Marcus's eyes filled with gratitude as he accepted the promotion. He had always worked hard, but in that moment, he understood that his loyalty to the company and to Vivian had paid off. Jennifer Kim, the junior ground crew member who had shown basic human decency by standing up for Vivian, was also recognized. Vivian saw something in Jennifer that she wanted to cultivate, a sense of fairness, an eye for detail, and the courage to do the right thing even when it was hard. Vivian awarded Jennifer a full scholarship to an aviation school, ensuring she would have the training and resources she needed to rise through the ranks. I believe in you, Jennifer, Vivian said. You showed us all what it means to stand up for what's right, and I want to help you grow into the leader you're capable of becoming. The recognition of Marcus and Jennifer set an example for the rest of the company. Vivian made it clear that those who demonstrated integrity, compassion, and respect would be rewarded. Meanwhile, those who chose to disregard those values would face the consequences. This wasn't just about making Vivian's company better. It was about creating a new standard for the entire industry. A reflection on legacy. The Carter family's new direction as the weeks passed, the transformation of Carter Aviation Group began to take shape. Vivian walked through the halls of the company, feeling a sense of pride she had never experienced before. The changes were visible not just in the policies, but in the attitudes of the employees. There was a new energy in the air, a sense of unity, of shared responsibility, and of purpose. Vivian reflected on the journey her family had been on. The Carter family had built an empire, yes, but they had done so under the shadow of privilege and secrecy. Her father, Charles Carter, had always believed in keeping a low profile, avoiding the spotlight. But Vivian had come to understand that true leadership wasn't about hiding in the shadows. It was about stepping into the light, owning your actions, and being accountable for your impact on the world. When Vivian arrived at her father's 70th birthday celebration in the Hamptons, 3 hours later than expected, she was emotionally drained. But Charles Carter saw something in his daughter that he hadn't seen before. He didn't see the businesswoman who had closed billion-dollar deals, or the quiet, invisible leader she had always been. He saw someone who had faced adversity and turned it into an opportunity for transformation. You turned the worst day into the best lesson, Charles said, his voice filled with pride. Your mother would be so proud. Vivian smiled softly, but the weight of the words hit her. Her mother, who had been a silent force behind the family's success, would have been proud to see her daughter take this bold step. Vivian had turned a painful moment into a defining one. She had changed not just her company, but the legacy of her family, and she had done it with grace, integrity, and courage. The ripple effect, a model for corporate America. Vivian's actions didn't just change her company, they changed the entire industry. Carter Aviation Group became a case study in how to handle systemic discrimination, not with vengeance, but with a revolution. The ripple effect of her decisions spread quickly, and soon other aviation companies were scrambling to implement similar policies. Vivian's leadership style gained national recognition. She was invited to speak at conferences, to testify before Congress about workplace discrimination, and to serve on panels about corporate responsibility. The woman who had spent her entire life avoiding publicity had become one of the most respected voices in American business. Her story, of how she turned humiliation into transformation, became an inspiration to thousands of entrepreneurs, CEOs, and leaders who were eager to emulate her example. Vivian had proven that true power wasn't about privilege or status. It was about using that power to create real change. And her company's legacy would forever be defined by her willingness to use her wealth to help others, to right the wrongs, and to build a world where respect was no longer optional. She was no longer just a passenger, no longer just an owner of the company. She was a leader who had been wronged, and now her leadership would be tested in ways she had never anticipated. The long white corridors of the jet seemed to echo her thoughts, as if the very space was vibrating with the tension she carried. The conference room at the back of the plane was set up for meetings, with its sleek wooden table and comfortable chairs, a place where executives came together to discuss multi-million-dollar contracts. Today, however, it was about to become the courtroom for a very different kind of judgment. Vivian took her seat at the head of the table, not as the passenger who had been humiliated outside, but as the CEO of Carter Aviation Group, and the employees who had wronged her. Stephanie, David, and Captain Hayes sat across from her, looking like defendants in a criminal trial. The weight of the moment settled over the room. Vivian's eyes scanned the group, lingering on each person before finally speaking. "I want to understand," she began, her voice calm, but dripping with authority, "how my own employees could treat anyone the way you treated me today." The question hung in the air like a challenge. The silence that followed was deafening. Stephanie, once so confident, now looked as if she might crumble under the weight of her own actions. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, unable to meet Vivian's gaze. "I want an explanation," Vivian continued, her voice now like steel. "What was it about me that made you think I didn't belong in this space? Was it my clothes? My demeanor? Was it the color of my skin?" Stephanie squirmed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I didn't mean," she began, but Vivian cut her off. "You didn't mean to humiliate me in front of everyone." Vivian's tone was icy now. "You didn't mean to question my right to be here, in my own company space." Stephanie didn't respond. Her face flushed, but Vivian could see the realization settling in, the gravity of the mistake she had made. Vivian's eyes narrowed. She could feel the shift in the room as the others, David, Captain Hayes, and Marcus Thompson, realized they were now part of something much bigger than a simple misunderstanding. "Do you understand the consequences of your actions?" Vivian asked. She looked directly at David Palmer, the terminal manager, who had been complicit in the earlier incident. "Do you understand what it means to make assumptions based on race? To deny someone access because they don't look the way you think they should? Because they don't fit into your narrow idea of who belongs in this world?" David's face went pale as Vivian's words hit him. He had spent years in the private aviation industry, in an environment where power and privilege often overshadowed human decency. But here, in this room, Vivian was forcing him to confront something he had spent his entire career avoiding, the truth about his own biases, and the reality that he had just humiliated the owner of the company he worked for. "Ma'am, David started, but Vivian didn't let him finish. "No," she said firmly, raising her hand. "Don't apologize for the words you've said. Don't apologize for the assumptions you've made. Apologize for your actions. Apologize for the fact that you thought you could get away with treating someone like that." David's mouth went dry as he tried to speak, but his words failed him. Vivian's gaze turned to Captain Hayes, who had witnessed the entire incident, but had done nothing to intervene. She could see the fear in his eyes. He, too, was realizing the extent of what he had just been complicit in. "Captain Hayes," Vivian said, her voice steady, "I want you to tell me why you stood by and watched this happen. Why didn't you speak up? Why didn't you defend your CEO when you knew something was wrong?" Hayes cleared his throat, trying to gather himself. I didn't want to get involved. It wasn't my place," he mumbled, but Vivian could see the guilt in his eyes. He had known something wasn't right, and he had chosen to ignore it. He had let it happen, and now he had to face the consequences. Vivian looked around the table, meeting each of their eyes one by one. She could feel the weight of this moment. It wasn't just about correcting one employee's behavior. It was about setting a precedent. It was about making sure that no one in her company, or anyone in the aviation industry, would ever feel the way she had felt today. "I am done with this," Vivian said, her voice ringing out with finality. "This culture of silence, of bias, of allowing discrimination to thrive, this ends now." She leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table in front of her. "We are going to change this company from the inside out, and it starts with you. You are not just going to walk away from this. You're going to own up to your mistakes, and you're going to make sure they never happen again." As Vivian stood there, looking out of the aircraft's window, the finality of the decisions she had made earlier began to settle in. The rain had stopped, but the storm inside her, this storm of change, was only just beginning. The events of the day had shaken her to the core, but they had also awakened something powerful within her. It wasn't enough to simply fire a few employees or punish those who had wronged her. She needed to go deeper. The systemic issue in her company, the culture of exclusion, bias, and complacency, had been exposed, and now it was her responsibility to fix it. As the plane ascended into the skies, leaving Westchester County Airport behind, Vivian thought about what had transpired over the past few hours. A small part of her felt the sting of the humiliation she had endured, but much larger was a deep sense of resolve. She knew what had to be done, and she knew that, despite the emotional toll it had taken, this moment would serve as the catalyst for the most significant transformation in the history of Carter Aviation Group. Company-wide reforms, a cultural overhaul. Vivian wasted no time. The very next day, she called an emergency meeting with her senior leadership team. As her colleagues filed into the boardroom, Vivian could see the weight of the moment on their faces. They all knew that the culture of their company had been compromised, and they understood that Vivian was not the type of CEO to let that slide. "I don't need to explain what happened yesterday," Vivian began, her voice sharp but filled with purpose. "Everyone here knows what went wrong, and now we fix it. Not tomorrow, not next week, today." Vivian's eyes scanned the room, meeting the gaze of each senior leader. "We are going to implement mandatory diversity and inclusion training for every employee, from the janitors to the executives. This company is going to take an active stance against discrimination. We will foster an environment where everyone, regardless of their race, gender, or background, feels they belong. We're going to rebuild this company from the ground up, starting with our values." The room was silent as Vivian's words settled into the minds of her team. This wasn't just a few HR workshops or diversity seminars. This was a commitment to change, a commitment to dismantling the biases that had been allowed to thrive, unchecked, for far too long. Vivian knew it wouldn't be easy. Change never was. But she had the power to lead it, and she was ready to use every ounce of that power. The zero-tolerance policy, leading by example as part of the company's cultural overhaul. Vivian introduced a strict zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. Anyone who engaged in discriminatory behavior, regardless of their position or seniority, would face immediate consequences. The policy would be enforced by a combination of regular audits, anonymous reporting systems, and comprehensive monitoring of internal communications. Vivian also made it clear that she would be leading by example. She would be visible in the company, not just as a CEO behind a desk, but as a leader on the front lines. She would conduct surprise visits, attend employee meetings, and make herself accessible to everyone in the organization. Vivian knew that the best way to shift the culture was to show her commitment. She wanted every employee to know that she wasn't just asking them to change. She was doing the same. "I'm not just going to sit in my office and expect change to happen," Vivian declared to the entire company during a video broadcast that reached every employee. "I'm going to be out there, talking to you, understanding your challenges, and listening to your concerns. And I expect every one of you to hold each other accountable." Stephanie, clearly unbothered by the weight of her mistake, interrupted, "You probably saw this plane and thought you'd try your luck." Vivian's jaw tightened, but she remained calm. "You know, people like you," Vivian's voice dropped just slightly, "are the reason this company needs to change." Stephanie's eyes narrowed, the smugness on her face starting to waver. Vivian knew she had made an impression, but it wasn't enough yet. The shift in Stephanie's demeanor was small, but it was there. It was like a crack in a dam, small at first, but soon enough, the pressure would break it wide open. At that moment, Marcus Thompson, the ground operations supervisor, walked over, clearly uncomfortable with what was unfolding. He had been standing off to the side, watching the exchange, with growing concern. As Vivian turned her gaze toward him, he hesitated, then spoke. "Stephanie, maybe we should just check her credentials properly," Marcus said, his voice softer, less certain than Vivian had expected. "Stay out of this, Marcus," Stephanie snapped. "I know how to do my job. I'm looking out for the security and reputation of this company." Vivian's eyes flicked back to Stephanie, her calm exterior betraying nothing of the storm brewing inside. She knew that this was more than just one woman's bad attitude. It was part of a much larger issue, a systemic problem within the company, and Vivian knew that it was time for it to be addressed. As Stephanie turned to call for security, Vivian made her move. She pulled out her phone with deliberate slowness, her fingers steady as she dialed. Her voice was unrecognizable from the soft tones she had used just moments ago. This was the voice of someone who commanded boardrooms and handled billion-dollar deals. "I think it's time we discussed exactly what kind of reputation you've been building here," Vivian said calmly, the phone pressed firmly to her ear. She looked directly at Stephanie as the call connected. The woman who had been disrespected was now standing on the precipice of exposing everything. Stephanie and David exchanged a glance, the fear slowly creeping into their expressions. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The minutes dragged on like hours, as Vivian stood there, her phone pressed to her ear, her calm but commanding voice sending ripples through the air. On the other side of the terminal, Stephanie fumbled with her phone, trying to dial security, but Vivian's presence in that moment had already begun to shift the energy around her. The cocky confidence Stephanie had exuded earlier was starting to crack. "Stephanie," Vivian said into the phone, her tone unrecognizable from the composed passenger it had once been, now stripped of any pretense. "This is Vivian Carter, and I think it's time we discussed exactly what kind of reputation you've been building here." The words landed like a thunderclap, shaking the air around them. For a brief moment, the entire terminal seemed to freeze. Stephanie's face went ashen, and she looked at Vivian, her eyes widening as the weight of what had just been said began to settle into her mind. She had assumed she was dealing with just another wealthy passenger. But Vivian wasn't just any passenger. She was the CEO of the very company that owned this private jet, this lounge, this airport. The realization hit her like a sledgehammer. But instead of backing down, she doubled down on her mistake, her voice dripping with condescension. "Carter," she scoffed, her voice oozing with mockery. "Oh, so now you're claiming to be related to the Carter family? What's next? Are you going to tell me you're the Queen of England too?" Vivian's gaze never wavered. She was used to the mockery by now, the dismissiveness that came from people who assumed they knew better. But something about Stephanie's voice, the unshakable certainty in her words, pushed Vivian to the point where she had no choice but to expose the truth. "Actually," Vivian said, her voice dripping with icy authority, "hold that thought for just a moment. I want to give you one more chance to show me who you really are." For a second, the air around them seemed to get colder, the world holding its breath. Stephanie was already flustered, her nerves bubbling to the surface. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone, trying to dial security. But she could sense something was coming, a shift she wasn't ready for. Vivian took a deliberate pause, her eyes locked on Stephanie's. She could see the moment when Stephanie began to question everything she had believed about Vivian. It was clear that she had made an irreversible mistake, and it was eating at her. But Vivian wasn't going to let her off that easily. She wasn't just going to let this moment slide. "Ma'am," Vivian continued, her voice now low and purposeful, "you seem to think my credentials are fake, but you don't get to question me based on your own biases." Vivian reached into her purse, her fingers brushing against the cool leather of her wallet, then slowly pulled out her American Express Centurion card, her company identification, and her driver's license. She placed them on the counter in front of Stephanie, each document a powerful testament to her identity. Stephanie barely glanced at them, still convinced that she knew better. "These could be fake too," she muttered dismissively. "Do you know how easy it is to get fake IDs these days? I've seen it all before." Vivian could feel her patience wearing thin. She had dealt with discrimination before, time and time again. She had grown used to it. But this was different. This was a challenge she couldn't let slide. Because, in this moment, it wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or treated like they didn't belong. And Vivian wasn't going to be the one to let that continue. Not today. "Let's not waste time," Vivian said, her voice cutting through the thickening tension. "You've already made your assumptions, but now it's time for you to face the truth. I'm Vivian Carter. I own this company, and I'm done with your disrespect." The air seemed to go completely still. David Palmer, the terminal manager, had been standing at the edge of the scene, his posture stiff, watching the exchange unfold. He hadn't stepped in before, assuming that Stephanie would handle things. But now, as Vivian spoke, he could feel the reality of the situation hit him like a brick. This wasn't just a simple passenger dispute. This was something much bigger. And suddenly, he was no longer sure what to do. "What?" he stammered, his face paling as he looked between Vivian and Stephanie. "You're Vivian Carter." Vivian nodded slowly. "Yes, I am. The CEO of Carter Aviation Group, and I don't tolerate discrimination in any form, especially not from my own employees." Stephanie's face went white as a sheet. She looked as if she were about to collapse under the weight of her mistake. David's face flushed with shame. He had assumed Vivian was just another undeserving passenger, but the realization was beginning to settle in. This was the CEO, the woman whose name commanded billions of dollars, the woman who had built this company with her own two hands. Vivian's phone buzzed again, the tone sharp against the thick silence. She glanced down at the screen. Her assistant, Sarah, was calling again. Vivian quickly answered, but this time, her voice was colder, sharper. I need a full investigation launched immediately. Security footage from Terminal 7, right now. I want a complete review of all hiring and training practices in the private aviation division. And I want everyone involved in this incident to be held accountable. Her voice didn't waver. The authority in her words was impossible to ignore. David swallowed hard, his earlier smugness evaporating into panic. He realized, too late, that the woman he had just humiliated was not only the most powerful person in the room, but also the one who held the future of Carter Aviation in her hands. Vivian wasn't finished yet. As she ended the call with Sarah, she turned her attention back to Stephanie, David, and the others around her. She could feel the shift in the air as everyone suddenly realized the gravity of the situation. Stephanie, David, Marcus, everyone involved, Vivian said, her voice carrying the full weight of her authority. You will all be reporting to the aircraft's conference room immediately. We're going to have a conversation about respect, discrimination, and consequences. Vivian walked up the steps to the aircraft, her heart pounding with a sense of quiet but intense power. As she passed through the door, the jet's luxurious interior seemed like another world, one that, for so many, was an unattainable dream. But today, that world was tainted by the bitter reality of the treatment she had just endured. The lounge. She wasn't just some wealthy passenger being denied entry. She was the CEO of Carter Aviation Group, the very company that owned the terminal she had just been humiliated in. But no one here knew that. Vivian wasn't a stranger to the power of her name, but she preferred to keep it out of the spotlight. The Carter family had built an empire over 3 generations, from luxury hotels to tech companies, and of course, Carter Aviation Group. It was one of the largest private aviation companies in North America. But Vivian, the woman who had led the company into new heights, deliberately stayed out of the public eye. No social media accounts, no red carpet appearances, no magazine interviews. She didn't crave the fame that so many of her peers sought. Her power wasn't in the headlines. It was in the boardrooms and the quiet negotiations behind closed doors. She was a strategist, a visionary. She made deals worth billions, but she did so from behind the scenes. And now, sitting in the corner of the lounge, she thought about the path that had led her here. 12 hours earlier, she had been in London, finalizing a $3 billion acquisition deal. She had sat across the table from some of the most powerful people in the business world, her mind sharp, her voice steady. Vivian had never been one to shy away from high-pressure situations, whether it was navigating corporate negotiations or making life-changing decisions. She had always been in control. But today, she was reminded that no matter how much control you think you have, the world can still find ways to push you aside. Vivian had spent years building her reputation, ensuring that Carter Aviation Group's name was associated with luxury, quality, and prestige. Her family's legacy was her life's work. And yet, here she was, in her own company's lounge, treated like an intruder. It was a moment of realization, an awakening. The legacy of the Carter family was one of quiet power. Their wealth was built on discretion, on staying behind the scenes and letting their business speak for itself. But Vivian had learned that in a world so fixated on appearances, discretion didn't always guarantee respect. Her silence, her preference for privacy, had allowed these systems of bias to thrive unnoticed, even within her own company. And now, as she sat there soaked in cold, her mind was turning over how to fix that. Vivian wasn't naive. She knew that she stood apart from many in her industry, not just as a woman, but as a black woman in a sea of predominantly white, male executives. But she had never let that define her. She had built her success on skill, determination, and intelligence. She wasn't interested in playing the race card. She had worked hard to ensure she wasn't judged for her skin color. But today's events reminded her of the harsh truth. No matter how hard she worked, no matter how many billions she made, there were still people out there who would see only her race, her gender, and her appearance. Vivian's phone buzzed, breaking her from her thoughts. It was her assistant, Sarah, calling to check in. Vivian stared at the phone for a moment before answering, knowing the conversation would be anything but normal. Vivian. Sarah's voice was light, as if she hadn't sensed the storm brewing at the airport. How's the flight looking? Ready for your father's celebration? Vivian took a deep breath, pushing the anger from her chest, forcing the calm back into her voice. I'll be on the flight, Sarah, but I'm going to be late. I have something to handle first. There was a pause on the other end. What's going on? Just a little situation at the airport. I'll fill you in when I get to the plane, Vivian replied, her voice steady despite the boiling rage under the surface. As she ended the call, Vivian felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just an isolated incident, it was an example of a much bigger issue. The culture of her company, of the industry at large, had allowed this kind of behavior to go unchecked, and it was up to her to change that. Vivian wasn't just fighting for her dignity anymore. She was fighting for the dignity of every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. She was fighting for the culture she wanted to create at Carter Aviation, one where no one would ever be treated the way she had been today. Her father, Charles Carter, had always told her that leadership was about more than just making decisions. It was about standing up when no one else would, even when it was inconvenient or uncomfortable. And this was one of those moments. Vivian wasn't going to let this moment define her. She was going to let it fuel her as she stood up from the corner, brushing off the remnants of the rain that had soaked her. She knew that everything was about to change. The woman who had been humiliated in this lounge, the one standing in the rain, would soon be the one leading a revolution. She would take control of this situation. She would take control of her company. And this day, this humiliating moment, would be the catalyst for it all. The rain had begun to taper off, but the air still felt thick, heavy with the tension that had been building all day. Vivian walked across the tarmac with quiet resolve, her heels clicking against the wet pavement as she approached the sleek white jet that awaited her. The private aircraft, worth $12 million, sat like a silent sentinel, just as it had for countless other flights she had taken. But today was different. As she reached the entrance, she was greeted not by a friendly face, but by an air of hostility. Stephanie Williams, a senior flight attendant who had been with Carter Aviation Group for 5 years, stood at the bottom of the stairs, blocking her path. Vivian paused, sizing up the woman before her. Despite her designer heels, elegant posture, and expensive luggage, Stephanie looked at her with disdain, as if she didn't belong. It was a look Vivian had grown too accustomed to, but it stung nonetheless. "Excuse me," Stephanie said, her voice carrying an almost mocking tone as she stepped forward, placing herself between Vivian and the aircraft. "This is a private aircraft. You can't just walk up here. I need to see your credentials." Vivian's gaze didn't waver as she looked at the woman before her. Calmly, she reached into her purse and pulled out her boarding pass. "I'm here for the flight to Westchester," Vivian replied evenly, her voice as steady as the rain had been just moments ago. But Stephanie wasn't having it. She barely glanced at the documents before shaking her head. "Ma'am, you don't look like the type of person who flies private. Are you sure you're not supposed to be at the commercial terminal? It's about a mile that way." The words stung, each syllable dripping with a level of condescension that was hard to ignore. Vivian could see the judgment in Stephanie's eyes, an assumption made purely based on her appearance. It was clear that Stephanie, despite being an employee of the very company Vivian ran, had already decided that someone like Vivian couldn't possibly belong in her world. It was a world where private jets and luxury were reserved for people who fit a certain mold. A mold Vivian didn't match in Stephanie's eyes. The words hung in the air like poison. Stephanie's tone wasn't just dismissive, it was full of contempt, and it made Vivian's blood boil. She had faced prejudice before, of course, As a black woman in the business world, she was no stranger to being underestimated, no stranger to being doubted. But this was personal. This wasn't just someone questioning her right to fly. It was someone questioning her right to exist in a space she owned, to walk in a world she had built with her own hands. Vivian stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the situation settle over her. She wasn't just facing one individual's prejudice. She was facing the weight of an entire system, one that had been built to exclude people like her from spaces of power, spaces of influence, and spaces of authority. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was how the system worked, and Vivian knew, deep down, that if she didn't take action now, this would continue. It would continue for her, and for countless others who didn't have the same power or platform to fight back. "I have my boarding pass right here," Vivian said, pulling it out again and holding it in front of Stephanie. Stephanie barely glanced at it before dismissing it with a wave. "These could be fake." "Do you have any idea how much it costs to charter this aircraft?" she scoffed. $75,000 per flight. Does that sound like something you can afford? Vivian's composure was remarkable, though the change in her eyes was unmistakable. There was a shift, a subtle change in her demeanor. She had always been the type to remain calm, to diffuse tension with her words. But now, there was a quiet fury simmering beneath the surface. The woman who stood before Stephanie was no longer just a passenger trying to board a flight. She was the CEO of Carter Aviation Group, and this situation, this injustice, was about to be corrected. "Actually, there seems to be some confusion here," Vivian began, her voice taking on an edge of authority that made the air crackle with power. "The only misunderstanding here is you thinking that I don't belong on this aircraft." The Westchester County Airport was unusually quiet for a late afternoon. The occasional roar of a jet engine would break the calm as planes made their way to distant destinations. The gentle hum of the tarmac, accompanied by the distant chatter of travelers, blended into the background. But none of that mattered to Vivian Carter. For her, everything stopped when the voice cut through the air. "Get away from here and wait outside. You have no business being here." The words were sharp, cutting into the silence like a knife. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Vivian stood there, frozen in place, feeling the sting of both the words and the way they were delivered. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the tone, the dismissal, the disgust. The flight attendant's voice was dripping with authority, as though Vivian had somehow overstepped her place. Vivian took a slow, steady breath. She was used to being in control, to having her presence acknowledged with respect, but not today, not here. Her mind raced for a split second as she processed the situation. Vivian Carter, at 37 years old, one of the most influential women in aviation, humiliated in her own domain. This was a woman who had spent the last decade of her life making decisions worth billions. She had transformed Carter Aviation Group into one of the largest private aviation companies in North America. But none of that mattered now. None of her success, none of her wealth, seemed to matter in the face of blatant, undistilled prejudice. "Wait outside," the gatekeeper repeated, his tone hardening as if to remind her of her place. Vivian looked around. A man in a simple polo and khakis strolled by, casually waved in by the same gatekeeper without so much as a glance at his credentials. The disparity hit her like a punch to the gut. Was this what they saw when they looked at her? The stark contrast between the way the gatekeeper treated her and the casual respect given to the white man was undeniable. But what hit her harder was the realization that it wasn't just about her. It was about the culture of discrimination that had taken root in the very company she had spent her life building. She had worked for this moment, fought tooth and nail, to reach the place she was in. But here, standing in the rain outside the lounge, she was treated as if she didn't belong. She knew that in this moment, it wasn't just her pride on the line, it was the integrity of the company she led, and as The rain began to fall heavier. She could feel the weight of this moment. The world was about to see just how wrong they were to underestimate her. Vivian stood under the overhang of the terminal, watching the rain pour down in sheets, the droplets splattering against the polished floor of the tarmac. The cold, sharp wind whipped through the airport, but it couldn't match the chill running through her veins. She had been coming to this airport for years. This lounge, tucked away from the chaos of the terminal, had been her quiet refuge. Here, she could escape the demands of her multi-billion-dollar company and relax before a flight. But today, that refuge had become a battleground. The gatekeeper. David stood before her with his arms crossed, scanning her documents with an almost theatrical air of suspicion. He looked at her boarding pass like it was a forgery, something to be examined under a magnifying glass. "These don't look right," he announced loudly enough for the nearby staff to hear, his voice ringing with authority. "I'm sorry, but these credentials don't look right. Are you sure you're supposed to be here, ma'am?" Vivian didn't flinch. Her gaze stayed steady, but inside, a storm was brewing. The nerve, the audacity of this man to question her right to be here, in this very lounge. A lounge that she had been granted access 2 years ago, not because of luck, but because her family had built the very empire that Carter Aviation Group represented. She had every right to be here, yet she was being made to feel like an outsider. The injustice of it all threatened to overwhelm her, but she pushed it down. "I assure you, my credentials are authentic," she replied calmly, her voice smooth but firm. A clear contrast to the contempt in David's tone. David didn't seem to care. With an almost dismissive wave, he continued to scrutinize her documents. "Ma'am," he said, leaning in a bit too close, "do you understand what kind of facility this is?" He gestured to the lounge behind him, where the plush leather seats and polished marble floors gleamed in the soft lighting. "This lounge has a $50,000 annual membership fee. Our clients are Fortune 500 CEOs, heads of state, Hollywood royalty. They pay for exclusivity and privacy." He paused, as if savoring the moment before continuing. "You really think these credentials are good enough?" Vivian's eyes narrowed. The arrogance in his voice, the way he spoke to her, as if she was some imposter, made her stomach turn. She had worked harder than anyone in this room to get to where she was, but none of that seemed to matter to David. His assumptions about her, based solely on her appearance, were made in an instant, and now she was being humiliated in front of the other passengers. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she watched as a white man, dressed casually in khakis and a polo shirt, walked past them. David's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. He straightened up, wiped any trace of skepticism from his face, and greeted the man with a warmth that hadn't been afforded to her. "Good afternoon, Mr. Patterson," David said with a smile, stepping aside. "Right on time for your flight to Miami? Please, go right in." There was no demand for a boarding pass, no questions, no scrutiny, just immediate access. Vivian stood there in stunned silence, feeling the weight of the moment. The contrast between the way she had been treated and how Mr. Patterson was welcomed couldn't have been more glaring. She was a billionaire, one of the wealthiest women in the country, and yet, in this moment, she was invisible. Her success, her family's legacy, meant nothing. To David, she was just another black woman, out of place in the world of private jets and multi-million-dollar deals. David, oblivious to the message he was sending, looked at her with a smug smile. "You see," he said, turning back to her, "that's what our typical clientele looks like." He made a sweeping motion towards Mr. Patterson, who was now comfortably seated in the lounge, sipping his coffee. "Now, I'm going to need you to wait outside while I verify these suspicious documents." Vivian's heart sank. This wasn't just a personal insult. It was a systematic issue, prejudice so ingrained that it was invisible to those perpetuating it. It wasn't just David. It was the entire system that allowed someone like him to hold this kind of authority. To look at someone like Vivian and dismiss her outright. Wait outside, David repeated, his voice colder now. For the security and comfort of our legitimate members, I cannot allow you inside with questionable credentials. The rain was pouring harder now, but Vivian stood there, drenched, her hands tucked into her pockets, her posture straight and unwavering. 25 minutes. That's how long she stood outside, in the rain, as David made a show of verifying her credentials. Every minute felt like an eternity. She was used to being in control, used to calling the shots. But this time, she was powerless. She couldn't show who she truly was just yet. Not here, not like this. She was being treated like a criminal, and every moment she stood there, humiliated, was a reminder of how deep these prejudices ran. As she stood, other passengers, white, wealthy, and well-dressed, came and went. No one questioned them. No one told them to wait outside. The message was clear. Her race had disqualified her from belonging in this space. "Ma'am," David finally announced, his voice laced with feigned politeness. "I've decided to allow you access on a provisional basis because of the rain, but I want you to know that we'll be monitoring your behavior closely." Vivian could hear the condescension in his voice, as though he were doing her a favor by allowing her access to a place she owned. But she said nothing. She walked past him, her head held high, though the humiliation still burned deep inside her. She entered the lounge, soaked to the bone, her clothes clinging to her body. The warm air inside was a stark contrast to the cold, damp tarmac outside. But as she entered, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything had just shifted. This wasn't just a moment of personal embarrassment. It was a glaring example of a much larger issue. It wasn't just David. This was how her entire company viewed her. This wasn't just one employee's mistake. This was systemic. As she made her way to the far corner of the lounge, she couldn't help but think, this would be the day everything changed. The rain pounded against the terminal windows, the sound a constant reminder of the storm outside. But inside, Vivian sat quietly, her mind far from the mundane activities happening in